Terror with your friend, me. Hello, hi. It's your friendly feminist neighborhood biblical scholar, and we have been talking about the book of Esther as a text of terror. The last two videos have been setting the stage for us as we've walked through verses 1 through 9. We know that there's some heavy drinking going on in the second party thus far, noted in the text, and we've just heard that Queen Vashti is throwing her own separate girls' party. This video is going to take the lead from verse 10 of chapter 1. That's because readers are introduced to some new characters today. Verse 10 reads, quote, "On the seventh day, when the king's heart was pleased with wine, he said to Memucan, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served before King Ahasuerus," end quote. A few things to note here. 1, we are moving into a new scene of sorts in this story. This is, in many ways, a transition verse that gives some good information about our setting. The king's heart was pleased with wine. It is now the 7th day of this wine party, meaning he's proper drunk. However, 2, we meet 7 new characters who are, of note, all named. And I actually want to highlight this because it's not super common for side characters to be named. And we'll meet quite a few more unnamed folks throughout our time in the book of Esther that do deserve attention that the text does not give. It is a privilege to be named in the biblical text. However, the most important part and the topic of our discussion is what they are labeled: eunuchs. Eunuchs are not born, they are made. By which I mean to say that often when we talk about eunuchs, the predominant understanding of them is that they were born the male sex, chosen as children, and their testicles are crushed in order to render them infertile, castrated before puberty kicks in. It involves, from the beginning, a kind of sexual and physical mutilation. Depending on how the procedure was even carried out, it could involve the risk of infection or even death. They're often seen as beardless attendants in some of our reliefs. I also say the word chosen with a kind of carefulness here because it's complicated. Some of these children could be chosen by the empires or hegemons themselves, quote, captured by enemy armies and enslaved, end quote. There are instances even where poorer families would give these children up in the hopes that their becoming a eunuch would improve their life. But they are, in fact, separated from their families. They undergo a medical procedure that changes their future. And they're also brought into a system that teaches them how to become eunuchs. There's a kind of ritual process that's involved that also can include being given new names, which an amazing researcher on this topic, Charlotte Howley, notes, quote, "It removed their filiation, effacing their prior identities and imposing their new function, the protection and service of the king, into their very identity," end quote. The names we all encounter in chapter 1, verse 10 all have notable Iranian names, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were from birth Persian, right? They became Persian. Their familial ties are erased as they become a son of the palace. Now, this is also to say that this procedure does allow eunuchs to get close to the center of power, and it facilitates employment. They are able to do or oversee more special tasks. The term being used that is distinct from another service term, abad, here it is sarat. It's a term denoting a more specialty kind of service. There are some that may have even wanted to become eunuchs as, quote, "there was an opportunity despite this significant ambivalence for status, prestige, and power," end quote. So the ambivalence of the eunuch is both and. There is the ability to rise in status, but it requires significant loss. In castrating the sexed male child, they are effectively degendered. This is to say they don't ever become technically a proper man, one that in a patriarchal economy has a biologically destined necessity to produce offspring. Eunuchs can no longer do that. As Howley notes, they, quote, fail at both masculinity and femininity through their medical removal from the reproductive economy, end quote. Now, there's still some speculation that there were some eunuchs whose roles did not require castration, but they were still regarded as a eunuch. However, this is to say that becoming a eunuch was one that was marked by loss and violence, the loss of one's family, but also the loss of a potential future of making one's own biological family. However, it is that loss, because they were not able to produce offspring, because of their lack of familial ties, they were able to be close to the king and the king's cohort because they were no longer threatening to the king in those kinds of ways. Now, on this degendering, interestingly enough, Howley actually intentionally uses they, them pronouns for eunuchs, even though the grammatical gender in languages describing eunuchs are in the masculine. Quote, gender identity is far more complex than grammatical gender, and eunuchs in their degendered state are often set apart from both masculinity and femininity, end quote. Although we've talked a lot about what is, I would argue, very traumatic, Howley reminds us that although this is the beginning of their identity creation, it's also not the end. Indeed, Mona West also writes on the eunuchs as our story as those, because of their gender difference between the binary, are able to move freely between social and gendered boundaries where explicitly gendered bodies are bound to specific spaces. As we see in Esther already, we have two different parties with different gendered bodies. And as we'll see as we continue on in the book of Esther, eunuchs who are able to transgress these boundaries make them, quote, the only ones with all of the information in the story, end quote. Ironically, quote, eunuchs are the ones with the real power, end quote. Howley continues, quote, eunuchs made use of their powerful positions at court, along with the ideological tools of their respective cultural contexts, to assert identity where it had been destroyed, and a symbolic progeny where it had been taken away, in at times incredibly subversive ways. End quote. We'll keep all of this in mind as we meet other eunuchs throughout our story. There's still so much to talk about because these eunuchs are actually being commanded to do something that we'll talk about next time. Stay curious.